see the naked Greek, the barren Greek. You said it, brother. I didn't say it. Reaching back in all of his nakedness, trying to receive the flame, the same flame you saw on top of the library, reaching back for that flame. They got a watered-down brother here, but get the message. Where the skyscrapers of New York City, Chicago, and L.A. have to pay homage to the skyscrapers of ancient Kemet. And USC, how many of y'all Trojans went to USC? Never even looked at, there's some Trojans in the back. Didn't even look at the library when they walked in there. I'm not talking about y'all, I'm talking about them other Trojans. So here Thomas Cole in 1840, sitting there reflecting on the past, designing a church here. He's saying, man, I'm designing this church, and I know, because I'm a Freemason, that it goes all the way back to the pyramids of ancient Kemet. The Mamisi birth houses that gave birth to the Greco-Roman temples. And it's even intricately woven in the church today. They said the Canaans that came down from heaven, that was given to Imhotep by the god Ptah, the very Canaans that developed the concept of the primeval hill of the beginning, is right in the church today. And we're not going to get too much into that today. We'll have to deal with that on the 27th. So if y'all want to see that, y'all got to come see that lecture. But we're going to show you something strong nonetheless. So let's take a look at this thing. Because they're always trying to cut the map up and take Egypt out of Africa, put it in the Middle East. If that's the Middle East, where's the Middle West? But here you can see Kemet sitting right here in Africa. The Nile River, 4,100 miles in length, starting in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Zaire, surrounding the Great Lakes region, which is the source of the Nile, flowing down 4,100 miles through the Sudan, right through Ethiopia, on through Kemet or Egypt, and empties right into the Mediterranean. But they cut it right out of Africa and said it's in the Middle East. Anwar Sadat, when he became president, Jimmy Carter went over there and saw him and said, gee, I didn't realize you were so dark. This is what Carter said. And Carter said that to him, I'm the first pharaoh in 2,000 years. That's what he said. He said he's the first black person, first Nubian to return to the throne of Kemet in 2,000 years. And every time he came to America, he came and visited black folk before he went to the capital. You see why he didn't live too long. We move on. So you can see here the Nile begins where the ancient Egyptians said in heaven. They call this land the Ta-Neter land. Ta is land and Neter is God. The God's land. They call it Pane or Punt, the ancient land where the ancient ancestors and the gods came from. This was an intermediary boundary where the world of the living communed with the world of the departed. People who lived in this particular area were considered to be the spiritual ancestors, the spiritual contact with the ancestors. The ancient Egyptians sent pilgrimages back to this land to replenish their own kingdom, and we're going to show you how they did that. But this place they called heaven. This was called the primeval hill of the beginning. As you see the mountains here, as you come up, you come into the highlands in Africa. This was the summit of the earth. The equator splits Africa in half. At this particular point, this is where the sun and the sun is equal day and equal night at the equators, the vernal and autumn equinoxes. We ain't going to go into too much of that today, but suffice it to say, here you can see the story of Ptah, who rose up in the form of a primeval hill. And that time fire came and lived on top of the hill. This produced life. The geological processes in the interior of Africa, they said, produced life. See, the ignorant Europeans, they said the Egyptians had a lot of gods. They said it was a pantheon. But the ancient Egyptians, or the Kemetu, believed in the concept of one God from the very beginning. And they called the so-called gods Neter. The word Neter is where we get the word nature from. They said that before we were mortal men, we were netters. The ignorant Europeans said that they're saying that before they were mortal men, they were gods. But what the ancient Egyptians were saying is that before we were mortal men, we were H2O, water. We were helium. We were the very silica, the earth, Geb, the first concept of chemistry. In fact, the word chemistry comes from Kemet. The ancient Egyptians called the land Kemet. When the Arabs took over, they called it Al-Kemet. They developed a science called alchemy. And from alchemy, once they dropped the spiritual aspects of it, it became chemistry. So the first chemistry was the so-called netters, who represent the elemental forces of nature. And the ancient Egyptians said before we were mortal men, we were the elements of nature. It's a science. They weren't worshiping a bunch of gods on the wall. It was a science. The concept of creation told in the story of Ptah. So here you can see the word Kemet means black, literally means black. Kemet Nu means nation. Kemetah, the people. Just in case you brothers and sisters didn't think Brother Mathu was telling the truth. Here you can see here, this whole concept. I'm going to have to find that water, brother. I can't. If I can find that water. But anyway, you can see this whole concept of the primeval hill. The whole concept of the primeval hill right here. The hill rises up in the interior of Africa with over 40 volcanoes surrounding the Great Lakes region. And this black earth, which they call Kemet, which they showed as a form of a black burning rock, the symbol of Kemet, comes from the volcanic activity here, and the equatorial winds and rains, the inundation floods bring this black land to this barren desert, which is Egypt, to give life to this barren land. Without the floods from the interior, which is called heaven, where the god Ptah sets, there could be no life in Egypt. So they saw the god Ptah, the primeval hill, the earth maker, as they call it in the Paylands, primeval Paylands, the earth maker was creating the earth and sending it to Egypt. The god was. Can you see that? Is that clear? So here's a barren desert, symbolized by Set, and this desert, you could not sustain life without this river bringing over 80 billion cubic tons of alluvium and topsoil, dropping it down into the Mediterranean. This is why the capital called Mennefer, which we call Memphis today, was dedicated to Ptah, the god, because it was here that you could see the gift of the god Ta-Meri. Ta is land and Mary is the born land. The gift of the land, Ta-Meri, was deposited all over the place. And so this is where they built the monument in testimonial to Ptah in Memphis. Now see, white folks can't explain that. They can't explain that. They got to come up with some mystical, magical way of some spaceman came down and built the pyramid, or some Nordics came in from the north somewhere and built a civilization in Africa before they built one for themselves. Philanthropic white folks, we must understand that. Good-natured people. Built a civilization before they built one for themselves, left and fell into darkness until we came back and brought them back out of it again. This is the story they tell. So you can see because of that flooding, as the flood would come and deposit this land, the people would move up into the highlands and work on the monuments. It was a public works project. Wasn't no slaves, Jews building no pyramids. Those were craftsmen. Look at when you see the architecture of those pyramids, this is extreme craftsmanship. It was a public works project. They went in the highlands and built the pyramids because of the flooding. And they mapped out the land using instruments to determine whose land was where after the inundation subsided. That was called earth measurement, which we call today geometry. The first concept of triangulation. Triangulation, was that attributed to Pythagoras? You don't answer all these questions here in a minute. As you see geometry, geometry means the measure of land. Ain't no Greeks measuring no land over there in those mountains up there on Mount Olympus. This is where the earth measurement starts here. Pythagoras studied for 22 years in Kemet. Read Plutarch on Osiris and Isis. The Egyptians measured everything. We were obsessed with measurement and mathematics. You can see here the brothers measuring the gold. Now white folks measuring the gold. Took all the gold from us. We can't afford a little cheap gold chain. And they got jewelry stores from one end of the United States, Europe, all over, South Africa, or Zania, taking the gold at one time we measured because it was in our land, in Africa. Rightfully belongs to us. Measured everything, even the soul, the heart, was weighed on a scale, on the balance. You had to come before Tahuti thought, and your heart had to be just and true. As you see St. Peter's, we're not going to get into that today, but you see the key of life. Didn't St. Peter's have a key? Well, here you can see the key of life where the deceased is coming before the scales, before Osiris, where the heart is being weighed against the feather of truth.